Well, good morning, everyone. As our panelists get situated, great to be here and see so many seats filled in this ballroom. So with that, I'm Chief Sustainability Officer for Berkshire Hathaway Energy. Energy, obviously, is in our name, and sustainability is in our vision. With me today are some fabulous panelists, and I think you're going to hear some great information from them. And I would call on them to introduce themselves.
Good morning. My name is Mike Jung. I lead ICF's Climate Center. I'd love a quick show of hands. How many of you have heard of ICF? Most. How many of you actually know what ICF stands for? And you're not allowed to answer if you worked at ICF. So, one. You want to shout it out? The Inner City Fund. ICF started out as a bunch of Defense Department whiz kids back in the 1960s, led by a Tuskegee Airman, an Air Force pilot veteran from the Second World War. And they wanted to do some good at a time when everyone was trying to land people on the moon. They looked at inner city Washington, D.C., and they said, let's help these small businesses. Let's do what today we would call social venture funding. And so they helped these small businesses. They did some good. And then as they tried to figure out new ways to scale, the US EPA, what became the Department of Energy, government agencies needed help too. And obviously they couldn't capitalize government agencies, and so they became consultants. And today ICF has over 9,000 people in 80 countries, 80 offices around the world. And we work on health, education, environment, and climate. The Climate Center is, I think of it as a think tank within the consultancy. We get to ask the questions that our clients are not yet asking us, and it's a privilege to be here today. Thanks.
Hi, good morning. My name is Emily Fisher. I am the Executive Vice President for Clean Energy and the General Counsel for an organization called the Edison Electric Institute. That's the trade association for the investor-owned electric companies. Cathy is one of my members, I'm happy to say. And I look forward to talking to you today a little bit more about where we've come from, where we are, and where we're going, and the tools we need to get there.
And good morning, everyone. Doreen Harris. I'm the president and CEO of NYSERDA. NYSERDA stands for the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. So yes, coming from the opposite coast to report out on specifically the progress we're making specifically in New York, but also I'd say throughout the U.S. Northeast with respect to some very ambitious climate policies that we are responsible for implementing. So NYSERDA is the state's energy office, the state's clean energy agency, and ultimately the implementer of many of the policies necessary to get from here to there. I also co-chair New York's Climate Action Council, which is responsible for really laying out the pathways to get from here to there as well. So it's great to be here and to share our learnings and challenges along the way.
Thanks. So as we talk about where we are in this energy transition and take on the topic that we've been charged with discussing today on the strategies, policies, and funding needed to scale up our clean energy future. Let's start with level setting on where you think we are today. And Emily, you raised this issue, so can you kick us off on that?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Thank you for the question, and thanks for the invitation to be here. So hopefully this doesn't violate Assistant Secretary Rodriguez's admonition not to crow about the potential, but it might be useful to go back to go forward. And early this morning, DC time, EPA dropped its round 3 of the Clean Power Plan, so its rules under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from fossil-based generation. And we've all read it, so you can ask us all the questions. But and no one laughed at that, which is a little scary. I think maybe you think I have read it. But I will say that I worked on the first version of that in 2014. And I often think it would be interesting to go back in time and tell my 2013, 2014 self some things, because she would be surprised at what exactly has happened over the last 9 to 10 years. So I started at EEI 15 years ago. When I started, 70% of the electricity consumed in the United States was from coal-based generation. Last year, it will be less than 20. That's a remarkable transformation in a relatively short amount of time, and that has had significant impacts on our emissions profile as a sector. We were the highest emitting sector up until about 2016, and now I get to say we're number 2. Not, we're still working on it, but we were overtaken by the transportation sector as a result of, over the last 10 years or so, closing a huge portion of the coal fleet and transitioning to natural gas and a lot of renewables. And so as I sit here today, the sector as a whole is around 40% below 2005 levels of emissions, which is a lot of progress. But Cathy asked where we're going. So before the pandemic started, I thought of the 2020s as the decade of renewables and storage. I have 60 some odd members. More than 50 of them have made voluntary future commitments to reduce their emissions to zero or net zero before 2050. Some of them have 2035 goals, some of them have 2050 goals. That's going to be a reflection of a lot of resource mixes and other sort of company and region specific issues. And I figured the way we were going to continue to make progress on how much progress we've already made was through the deployment of a lot of renewables and storage in this decade. And so I still think that's true. I think we'll talk about some of the challenges to that and some of the things that I think are going to help excel us even further. But one of the things that we've always been focused on, or that became quickly clear to us as we made these ambitious goals, was that we were going to need new technologies to get us all the way to zero. And so I look forward to the conversation about how we go from there. But we're on a pathway. It's going to continue, sort of regardless of what happens on the policy front. And the conversation is, what can we do to bend that trajectory? And are we doing the things that will actually help us get there?
Mike, how about you? Where do you think we're at, and where are we headed?
Assistant Secretary Rodriguez used the term condition precedent, which I thought was a powerful way of framing how important our electric infrastructure is going to be as we move into this bold new future. In many ways, it is the platform into which we are plugging so much innovation on the clean energy and climate front. That said, I worry that we are putting a lot of eggs into this one basket at a time when we are asking so much of this infrastructure upon which we depend. And in particular, I worry that this is a sector that has to be far and away at the forefront of climate resilience, an infrastructure that is vulnerable, just like all of our infrastructure, to the effects of climate change which are underway. And this is an industry that they're doing as good a job as anybody, I would say, when it comes to preparing for climate resilience, mapping out their infrastructure, identifying their vulnerabilities, and getting ready to bounce back when they get hit. But doing as good a job as anyone is not enough, I think. We, I think, need to understand that the grid infrastructure is an infrastructure that is the condition precedent, and we need to really make sure that we support that infrastructure, invest in that infrastructure, and approach it in a way that makes it better than every other infrastructure that we have when it comes to being resilient to the effects of climate change, because it is the critical infrastructure for mitigating the impacts that are happening. It's the crux. It is the hinge upon resilience and mitigation, and I just wanted to point that out because evolution and revolution, are happening at the same time. I think evolution in the grid is, taking a vehicle or an asset and replacing it with a cleaner version, but basically doing the same thing you've always done and doing it with new toys. What does revolution look like? I think revolution means doing the things that we maybe had always wished we could do, but couldn't do until today. And this might be technology, but I think it's also policies and business models, and we'll go deeper into that. But I'm excited for the evolution because it's happening. We see it day in, day out already. It's underway. The revolution, it's probably happening, but we may not see it yet. These are seeds that have been planted but may not yet have sprouted. But all of this is happening on an infrastructure that needs to be more resilient than every other infrastructure that we have.
And Doreen, you probably have some perspectives on where we're at, particularly from the state of New York. Can you share those as well?
Well, I would agree with the point made with respect to the condition precedent being the grid. I mean, there's no secret sauce here that anyone has uncovered thus far that doesn't include an extraordinarily increased reliance on the electric grid. Like, full stop. The solution set that we have advanced in New York and certainly all across the country is an extraordinary reliance on electrification as the solution that will help us with other sectors of our economy, notably buildings and transportation. In fact, in New York, the buildings are actually the largest source of emissions. And when we think about how we get from here to there, one of the goals that's part of our climate law is a 40% reduction from 1990 levels by 2030. Just to give you an order of magnitude of what that really means, we have 7 million households in the state of New York. We need to be touching an order of magnitude greater. We touch about 20,000 households a year or thereabouts. We need to be touching 200,000 households. And in a state like New York, it can't just be electrification. It has to be weatherization and efficiency measures that are imparted at the same time due to our climate. And really the same for transportation. Light duty vehicle sales are maybe 7% today in New York. It needs to be 90 in the next 5 to 7 years. So not only are we relying more on the grid, that means our electric load is expected to double in the coming number of decades, but it also, not surprisingly, switches to a winter peaking system in about the next decade as well. So it's not just an expansion, but it's a transformation of the ways in which we're relying on the grid and the sort of conditions upon which we are. I'll just also say load growth is not just driven by electrification. It is largely the case, but not universally the case, because there is a desire for economic development, right, to come with all of this, all of these objectives. A great example is Micron. The company Micron is establishing a major fab in the Syracuse area in central New York. When that fab is fully operational, it will consume over 6% of New York's load. So, and they have massive sustainability goals, as they should be, right? They're coming in part to the state because they know the grid can be not only relied on, but green. And so how does one square that, right? This is a transformation that is happening not in many decades, of course in many decades, but also happening in the next single-digit number of years. And so when we start talking about some of the challenges, that's where I'd like to tee up some realities on the ground.
Thanks. And we know that policies and strategies have been developed over many years. So we have a basic toolbox to advance things. But as we talk about evolution and revolution this morning, there are certain tools that are better than others. And we have a new tool. And that's the tool that we've all been talking about, but maybe not seen implementation on yet. And that's the Inflation Reduction Act, combined with CHIPS and the IIJA. And so, Emily, what do you see in terms of use of these new tools driving progress further? And are there some pitfalls or speed bumps along the roadway that you think we're going to encounter?
Sure, that's a great question, Cathy. So we were big advocates of the clean energy tax incentives that were included in the Inflation Reduction Act. They provide a lot of certainty for financing, not just of renewables, but for some of those new technologies I alluded to. For some of those technologies, they're some of the first sort of financing assists that we've seen. And so we're very excited about using those tools. I mean, no one likes to talk about the utility accounting, but the way that those incentives were designed allow us to use those more efficiently within the sort of regulated model. Which I still am a sort of unabashed supporter of. I think it really allows us to mobilize a lot of private capital to do really big, important things. And we're the most capital-intensive industry in the United States, and it's just going to keep going, as Doreen pointed out. So we're big on the tax incentives. We think they're going to have a lot of impact. We're already seeing electric companies announce, more ambitious renewable deployment objectives in this decade. And I have many members who are planning or trying to go after, we're IIJA people. I know the government prefers the bipartisan infrastructure law, but I'm not a bill person, I'm an IIJA person. So I have many members who are participating in some of the public-private funding opportunities for hydrogen, for long-duration energy storage, for CCS, all very excited about all this stuff. But in the near term, one of the concerns I have, and IRA is only not even been a year, right? It happened sort of unexpectedly in August of last year. We're waiting for a lot of guidance from the Treasury Department about how we're going to implement some of the elements of the tax incentives. We're very big supporters of developing domestic fabs. I like that word, I'm going to use it. So that we have more resilient supply chains here in the US. But right now it's very difficult to procure locally produced solar panels, and I have big ambitious goals to deploy a lot of solar in the next couple of years, and I'm very concerned, and so are my member companies, about access to solar panels. Very excited about the hydrogen tax incentives. There's already clear that we do not have nearly the supply of electrolyzers that we might need, and it's going to be years before that supply chain is able to ramp up, and it probably won't be domestic either, and so there are some challenges there. We have great partnerships with labor, so we're excited about making sure that the tax incentives also build a strong economy that's good for workers, but there also might not be enough of them. So there are a lot of great things about these incentives, but a lot of the details haven't been worked out yet, and there are some potentials, I think, for some near-term hurdles, like I said, around whether or not we can meet domestic content requirements, whether or not the supply chains are really going to be there for us in the near term, and making sure that we can implement as quickly as possible. So those are some of my near-term concerns. But we're excited about the ability to use these tax incentives and go further faster, but we're going to need to work out the details first.
And details are always important. Michael, any elaboration that you want to provide on that?
That's a great way of saying it, Emily. I'm reminded because I'm a Boy Scout, and one of the key skills as a Boy Scout, at least growing up, is that you have to know how to start a campfire. And most people focus on getting the flint and the steel and just getting it to catch. And if you do that, you think you're done, maybe. But no, the next step is you have to get the kindling. And the kindling is what really makes it feel like a fire. And I think that's the stage we're at. For a long time, we've had a lot of innovators and dreamers and entrepreneurs out there hitting that flint against the steel, and we've had sparks. And with these pieces of legislation now, we finally got kindling. And that kindling means it looks like a fire, but it's not. Because I've seen it happen, I've done it myself. Anyone else done this too? You get the kindling, you feel like, oh, we got a fire now, and then you throw the log on it, and it's out. It's not right. It's not enough. We need to get to the point where the kindling is roaring sufficiently, and we're timing it right. We're doing it thoughtfully. We're putting bigger branches until you finally got a campfire, and eventually you get to where everyone wants to get with a campfire, which is s'mores. How do we get to s'mores when it comes to climate? A quick thought here. I just made this up. I have no idea if this is going to hold.
I liked it, though.
Climate s'mores. You mentioned mobilizing private capital. That, I think, is where we're starting to add logs. Now there's fuel on the fire that's going to hold. It's going to keep going. That private capital is going to be essential. In the United States, I think we're approaching that point, but that's not going to be enough because we need to do this globally. We need to mobilize international finance into developing countries to deploy the technologies that make it not a choice for these people, billions and billions of people around the world, between energy access or clean energy. Because that is a choice that they're facing right now. And if we do it right, I think we can mobilize international finance at the intersection of technologies being cost-effective and affordable, and I hope we have some sort of global free trade agreement on climate tech so that protectionist barriers don't get in the way of these things moving freely and fast around the world. Climate s'mores, folks. You heard it here.
I like it.
He's making me hungry now. So, Michael, you talked about the international piece. Doreen, you have a different perspective. All these federal policies are out there, and we're in the midst of implementation and getting additional guidance. But the states play such a critical role in moving things forward, either in conjunction with or on their own. So, New York's definitely demonstrated some leadership and achieved a degree of success with advanced climate policies. What do you see as some of the biggest barriers to implementation?
Well, I'll say Michael really hit a nerve there. There was a rumor we were taking away wood stoves in New York, so don't talk about combustion in that sense, please. No, just kidding. But ultimately, I guess that would be a particular challenge I would highlight. We certainly have been working hard over a series of decades to really build out renewable resources toward the achievement of our goals, and I think the last year has really given that effort a shot in the arm necessarily. Projects in the near term are actually struggling financially, which is an interesting juxtaposition with the long-term tailwinds that we really have to build out this industry at scale. So it's an extraordinarily tough time, I'd say, in the near term, which is an interesting observation given how exciting everything is, when one looks at the momentum that we now have over the next number of decades. Because it is true that the combination of inflation, supply chain issues, and interest rate differentials has placed our renewable portfolio and many projects that are advancing at risk. Their economics are not fantastic, and ultimately we really need these projects to move forward in the near term to realize this mid-transition, as some may call it, in which it's messy, right? We're building projects at the same time as we're trying to decommission projects across our state. We need the new projects to come online in order to really realize that transition. And in my world, that happens over the next decade to a large degree. So I'd say that's particularly challenging in the near term, and I'm extraordinarily optimistic in the longer term. The other thing, we as a state, and I mentioned the wood burning, but it's legitimately something we need to air out, that we cannot transform only the grid, the part that your average citizen doesn't really notice very much. We need to get after the ways people live and work. And that is just hard. That's hard on a social level. I'd call it a soft issue, but it's actually a very critical issue, is to realize that ultimately we need people to come along with us. This year in her executive budget, the Governor Hochul actually was successful in implementing the nation's first zero-emission new construction requirement for buildings, first for low-rise and then for high-rise over the coming number of years. That's where this gets personal. And it needs, of course, to be brought to bear with the technologies and solutions that I would say make people's lives better and their buildings healthier. But ultimately, it is a change that we need to realize and embrace and recognize that part of this becomes a communications and relationship issue. Again, spreading the word in more organic ways as well. We are taking extraordinary measures to take advantage of this trifecta of federal actions, not just through the provision of the tax credits that we watch every day for IRS guidance right along with everyone else to really move these projects forward, but also to bring new resources to bear toward those solutions. We've talked about the fact that there are likely solutions that are not deployed at scale that will be necessary in the coming decades. And I'm sure you couldn't get through a climate conference without talking about hydrogen as an example of one of those solutions. So we actually led a response to the Department of Energy's Hydrogen Hub FOA on behalf of 7 states and 100 partners to host a hydrogen hub in the US Northeast as an example. And what's really cool about this is that we are able to build these solutions that are regionally relevant. So in the case of New York, our hydrogen hub will be a clean, renewable hydrogen hub. And we'll be using that hydrogen for hard to decarbonize sectors like industry and heavy duty transport. That will be in contrast to other hubs, maybe Houston or, again, the Pacific Northwest as examples. But ultimately, what we're seeing is this leverage that we as states can benefit from to build out our own policies while getting more with the federal money that has now been brought to bear.
Yeah, leveraging that funding is so incredibly important, and you hit on the issue of change and how difficult change is. It's easy if somebody else does it. It's not so easy if you have to take some level of action. So in that regard, Doreen, can you identify, what's the highest level strategy that you think breaks through some of these barriers?
Well, specific to New York, but I think generally what we are really talking about is an economy-wide transition. And I say that because I think it's important to note that historically these policies have really been advanced through programs that are advanced specifically in the electric sector. Like we're a member of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative as an example of ways that we've really gotten after that sector. What we in New York are advancing now, and in fact also was included in the budget, is the advancement of an economy-wide cap and invest program that we know exists here on the West Coast, but really has not expanded across the country in ways that I think are necessary. As I said, we're talking about an economy-wide transition, We really need to place these levers in other sectors of our economy and also raise revenue, ultimately, in ways that can be reflective of the extraordinary, and I say it, extraordinary level of investment that we are talking about. You know, in New York, we concluded through the work of our Climate Action Council that it's very much worth it to invest in this manner. On the order of $115 billion worth of benefits are coming to our state through our transition. But it is an investment. With it comes investments that are needed, small relative to our energy costs in total, but significant with respect to all of those sectors that we are touching. So I say this because I think it necessitates a reality that we need to think differently. This isn't just about RPS programs scaling up anymore. Yes, we need policy instruments across all levels of government, but ultimately we need to be influencing decision-making with the sticks and carrots in every aspect of our economy.
All right. And as we think about the investments that are needed, we tend to focus on the major projects, justifiably so to a certain extent. But we talk about renewable expansion and we talk about transmission build out. All of those things require a heavy lift on siting and permitting. And we won't go in depth on that issue because I think the struggle is real and it's a struggle for all of us. But Michael, what are we missing when we think about these big projects?
Assistant Secretary Rodriguez had this encouraging message of, engage your neighbors, your friends in conversations about the infrastructure that we see, the poles and the wires. That's the distribution grid. Most of us think of the transformers as the distribution transformer. Very few have actually seen like a substation transformer or plant-sized transformer. The distribution grid is in some ways the capillaries of the system, but from a line mile perspective, from just a sheer number of things out there, it is exactly where we interface as people, as businesses, as citizens with that grid. And I fear that as we focus on the big things, we may overlook the idea that and the opportunity that if we can introduce innovations, not just technological innovations, but business model innovations and regulatory innovations into that space, we can actually downsize the need for transmission and generation infrastructure because the tail can start to wag the dog a bit. And I think that, in the spectrum of evolution, which is let's replace, a ICE car with an EV car or a furnace with a heat pump, we may not get to the revolutionary opportunities, which are let's use virtual power plants, and let's use devices at the edge of the grid to displace or replace or at least buy us time before we have to add new infrastructure that's harder to site, that's costly to build, that's a riskier climate investment even. We need to it's a weird term. We talk about hardening the grid against disruptions, but to harden the grid means adding flexibility, adding flexible load management, flexible grid edge technologies. So I don't know, it's sort of like Kung Fu, like Bruce Lee. You have to be like water to hit hard. And that's an idea that's hard for, I think, our sector to wrap its head around.
And those downsizing aspects are really important because they also drive costs, right? Big versus little, big costs versus smaller costs. And Emily, in our electric industry, cost is paramount. And so we're trying to make the transition in a way that continues to make electricity affordable for customers. How do you think affordability concerns are being addressed, or how could they impact the trajectory of greenhouse gas emission reductions?
I think that's such an important question. And I will say that I knew this, but I didn't understand it until the pandemic. And that is, energy prices are regressive, and they hurt the poorest among us the most. And what we saw during the pandemic, especially in the sort of early year, and I'm sure you saw this too, was just a huge number of customers who were no longer able to pay their bills, right? And spent a lot of time figuring out how to provide assistance, how to bridge people so that they didn't, it takes a long time to get your power shut off, but eventually if you don't pay, that might happen, right? And so we were like, that can't happen in America. No one can survive or have any sort of daily life without access to electricity. And it was disconcerting to see how many people were in crisis and to look at like whether or not the programs we currently have actually can provide the kind of support that people need, especially as we rely more on electricity. And while I totally agree with you that we need to be concerned about distribution stuff, it's also not free. Like, it's not like it's dramatically less expensive than investing in the transmission side. All of that stuff is gonna cost money, and it drives to lower cost generation, but the T&D spend is gonna go up. So we're really focused on affordability. We always say we gotta do affordable, reliable, and clean. And so the pandemic was a little bit of an eye-opener about how quickly things can get really expensive in ways that really harm people. And then, in addition to that, I think the natural gas price spikes that we saw over the last couple of years, which are sort of going back down now, really reminded us of how vulnerable we can be to sort of those fuel price fluctuations. And that really harmed a lot of our customers. And it also is going to constrain our ability in the near term to make investments in new clean stuff. Because state regulators are going to look at bills and say, I'm with you, I want a clean future, but I have people who can't afford their bills today. And so that is a real intergenerational equity issue that we have to grapple with. And so we've spent a lot of time thinking about how to do a better job of providing access to there's a lot of federal funding out there, there's a lot of state programs. How can we just do a better job of that? But we also have to think about how to make sure that we create space to make these investments in ways that really recognize who's paying. And that's one of the good things about the tax incentives. A lot of people are like, oh, tax incentives, that's a lot of federal funds. But the tax base is much more equitable than the electric base. There's some really interesting things going on in states like California where they're looking at income differentiated fixed costs. Once again, no one likes to talk about utility accounting, but those kinds of programs really matter. But I don't have a good answer to this question, but I think it's something that we all have to think about. And it's better to see more people thinking about these issues and recognizing the trade-off between what might be investments in clean and keeping things affordable. And then, of course, if electric prices go up too high, you're really going to curtail people's interest in electrification and not going to be able to help other sectors engage in some of the necessary decarbonization work that they can't do without electricity. So it's a tough issue, and it's really been brought to the forefront in the last couple of years.
Can I add a point?
Absolutely.
Emily, that's a great way of framing this. I'm concerned that the way we account for impacts and the costs of inaction also don't show up in the right places and in the right ways, and may be regressive as well. And so, the investments that we might need to clean up the system show up on utility bills in many ways. If we don't make those investments, it's not like those costs don't land somewhere. Someone is going to be impacted by the cost of inaction. That's not going to show up on your utility bill, but it is a real cost. We heard yesterday at the equity panel around the impacts that disadvantaged communities experience because they're not getting infrastructure, or they're suffering from the impacts of not having infrastructure deployed. Those are real costs. I don't know what the answer is for getting the accounting right and getting the billing right, but between taxes and utility bills, it's all in there. How it shows up isn't necessarily logical or sensible or ideal.
Yeah, and I think that the cost issue is so incredibly important, but the policy aspects far exceed what we're talking about in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because it's easy, maybe not so, but oftentimes it's easier to get the primary policy in place, but there are so many additional implications associated with that on affordability, on utility regulation. Doreen, I'll go to you, to kind of give the state perspective, and then Michael, perhaps we can go, I know you have some thoughts on utility regulation, so Doreen?
Well, the topic of affordability, it's truly, I think the panelists have all pointed out the reality on the ground. We literally will not be successful in any of this transition if we do so on the backs of low-income constituents. It's not going to work. And many of these policies do end up being regressive, which you have to keep an eye on for literally every decision that you make. New York's Climate Act has a lot of components that are quite similar to the Justice 40 work being accomplished on the federal level. I don't want to take credit for Justice 40. I'm not doing that. But I am saying that it's great that there's that alignment, because it is true that when you are moving quickly, as we all are, to address this threat and the reality on the ground, usually the easiest way to get from here to there is to do what you always did, just do it a lot bigger, right? Like just scale it all up. And that is very much at odds with the principles of justice, climate justice, environmental justice, and fundamentally protecting those most vulnerable from the perspective of both impacts and costs. And so that is just a huge challenge, because now we've layered on an extraordinarily relevant pace of addressing the issue with a very accurate point that in the near term, people cannot pay their bills that they have today. So when one thinks about this, the only way you can actually advance this is by being deliberate. Like, there's no great answer to it other than to say that when you make investments, you do so through the lens of Justice 40, or in New York, our disadvantaged communities criteria. You make sure you're deliberate and intentional with respect to where you are investing your money, and specifically how it will bring benefits to those communities. And when you design policies like utility rates or NYSERDA programs or cap and invest policies, you do so in a way that you at a minimum hold those same people harmless, and hopefully find ways in which they can benefit from those investments. It's a great example of this year's budget. We have a required rebate from our cap and invest programs, in which we ensure that at least 30% go back to the pockets of New Yorkers. It's one of the only ways that you can get from here to there, but it very much depends on the policy you're looking at to advance. And so I will let Michael answer the question on utility rates, though, as it relates to these investments.
I don't know if I have an answer on utility rates, but I think it's worth pointing out that many people point to the grid infrastructure as an aging infrastructure. The average age of a service transformer is something like 50 years or so now, close to that, and the average design life for these things is like in the 40-year range. So in many ways we are approaching, if not past, the past due date on these things. But the thing that's older than the infrastructure is the regulatory model through which this has been built. The regulatory model it's an adjudicated kind of system. In some states, they actually call utility regulators judges, and it's a court of law. It's trench warfare. These are adjudicated proceedings. It's a zero-sum game, and I think that probably was the right tool to get us to build out the system. Is it the right tool to rebuild and reimagine the system? I don't know, but I don't think so. How do we innovate in the regulatory space? How do we reform and reinvent that system at a time when the analogy's been made like we're flying an airplane and we're trying to change the engines? That's the technology side of it. I think the regulatory reform side of it is we're flying an airplane and we're going to swap the wings out for better wings. Scarier, harder, higher risk, but necessary because the plane is going down. We're going to need a better system to get there. The two thoughts that I'll share on how do we get there, some bright points. Con Ed in New York State has been a part of a system reforming the energy vision. They've done a great job of engaging the city of New York outside of the regulated proceeding space to build a climate resilience plan that lays the foundation for eventual investments that hopefully will go through a system that has been informed by collaborative engagement that takes place outside of the courtroom of law.
I feel like you're saying bad things about lawyers. Just have to say
Guilty.
that. Yeah, sorry.
I'm not saying bad things about lawyers
I'm
as
just
much
kidding.
as I'm trying to say that we need the lawyers to engage in a process that looks different from the process that we've had in the past to get here.
I totally agree with you. Like a more collaborative approach to rate reviews is probably necessary, and some innovation, I think, about how we approach those or what kinds of incentives we give electric companies is really important. But I gotta tell you, I think there are some really important things about the existing regulatory model that we have to be careful we don't lose.
Yes.
And one of them is universal service, because that is the deal that is made. And in exchange for recovering your prudently incurred costs and a regulated rate of return,
Obligation
you
to
serve
serve.
everyone. And I'm very concerned about a world in which everything is provided by a market and only people who have the most money can have the most clean, most reliable electricity. And I will tell you that I think there are really big lessons we need to learn from telecom dereg that we cannot have happen here. My phone hardly works as a phone. It doesn't make any calls, and the amount of money I pay for it bears absolutely no relationship to the cost of providing me that service. And I think there's real benefits in maintaining cost-based regulation and some review of costs if we're concerned about customers. So let's think about how to incentivize different behavior, but I think you'd be throwing like the baby out with the bathwater if we move to a regime in which we have no review or no regulator review of electricity rates. And I just think that doesn't get brought up enough. Everyone's all about, we need a new business model. What does the old business model have that is valuable? And I think universal service and some review of costs is really essential.
I agree. And the good news is that we're entering an era of increased usage. We're going to be relying on electrons to do a lot of the heavy lifting. And that has some similarities to the era in which we built out this infrastructure. Yeah, there's absolutely stuff that we need to make sure stays in the mix. And you know, the regulatory compact is you know, the basic kind of philosophical underpinnings are why every corner of America had electricity at a time when the rest of the world is still largely searching for energy access.
Well, and that whole regulatory dynamic and how we've approached things in the past, for years we've heard the aspect of, you know, energy efficiency. It's the cheapest, you know, best method to address some of these issues, but yet energy efficiency approaches need to change as well as we think about electrification of buildings, of vehicles. So we have some additional challenges on our hands too. And Doreen, do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I'd say, as you know, we at NYSERDA have had to very specifically amend the ways in which we think about delivery of the programs that were authorized by New York's Public Service Commission to effectuate. Because I would agree with you fully. We used to, you know, run an efficiency program and run a solar program and run a charging program and give someone a rebate for their EV, whatever, you know, all of those things. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is places, right? Like a place. What does this place need, whatever it may be, a low-income household or an industrial user, to really reach from where they are to where they need to be, at least according to our climate law. And so we've had to really amend the ways in which even programs are delivered to really reflect that place-based aspect of what we're talking about. Because why would we go to a house, let's just say a single-family home, and make it ready to be electrified from the perspective of heating, and not also make it ready to be electrified for their vehicle or the resilience necessary, as I said, the weatherization necessary to realize from point A to B. And really, when we think about buildings, I mean, talk about, I give buildings people the top, like that's the hardest nut to crack as far as I'm concerned, in a world of really hard things that we're doing, because often these homes are not even safe in the first instance. So you're starting with aspects of, you know, reinforcement of the structure before you do anything else. You know, that's the reality on the ground. And that's what we're talking about happening in New York, as I said, in 7 million households, but really across the country. And so you need to meet people where they are. And many people are not ready for a heat pump until you do a lot of other things first.
Well, our time is rapidly closing on us. Any last words from any of you that you'd like to share?
Well, I've enjoyed learning from this conversation, and I think you know, it's early days. We all have a lot to learn from each other, and as I think you know, at least in my part, I clearly don't have the answers. I can ask a lot of questions, but I don't have all the answers. We're going to have to come up with these answers together, and I'm glad that, you know, to see that critical mass of energy in the room from folks who've been at this for a long time. To I think there's some high school students here who are going to be the ones who carry the mantle going forward after we do our part. This is the group, this is the time, this is the generation that's going to, you know, help us come up with those answers to the questions that we've been exploring but certainly not solving.
You know, we spend a lot of time talking about hard things and challenging problems that don't have obvious solutions, or maybe we're still working on what the contours of those solutions might be. But I remain fundamentally optimistic about the progress we're going to make this decade. And we need a net zero economy by 2050. That feels very far away. And for me, I can wrap my brain around what can we do today and what can we do in this next decade. And I do really remain optimistic that we're going to continue to make progress. And we will work through some of these challenges. Things probably won't be as easy as I thought they were going to be in 2020, but I still think we're going to get there.
Yeah, I'd say as nation leading as New York always will be, and will always say we will be, the ultimate reality is you can't do any of this alone. And when I think about the ways in which, and it's not just because the federal government's in the room, like they have really created a situation where there is this race to the top that I find extraordinarily useful. We have these tailwinds that are so necessary to get from here to there, and now we see the global market shifting in response to the markers that the US has put down. Like that's really what we need. We need a movement, a global movement upon which to rely. And I'm with the panelists. There's a lot of reasons for optimism, despite what will inevitably be a bumpy road through the transition.
All right. Well, we invite you all to join us on the journey, and I invite you as well to thank our panelists